We started in 1959 on protecting the Allagash Wilderness Waterway, and we've been involved in just about every major environmental policy issue since. We've got an incredible staff, and we're right in the middle of the legislative session, so there's a lot of really interesting things happening. Mining rule hearings a week from Monday, just a big array of things happening, and we have a lot of material over at that table. I welcome you to take anything you want there. There's a nice calendar, there's a nice hot off the presses legislative priorities newsletter that describes the major environmental policy issues that we're involved with. So tonight I'm going to talk about the mining issue. I'm going to talk a little bit about the mining process, a little bit of history about mining in the state of Maine, what some of the major environmental issues are and financial issues associated with cleanup of mining operations. And then I'll focus on the legislative process and status of Maine's regulatory environment for protecting the people and the environment from the risks of mining. And mining has a history in Maine, but this is a fairly recent development that there's an active proposal or an active interest to pursue a copper, zinc, possibly precious metal mine in Bald Mountain up in Aroostook County. And this map shows some yellow blobs in the state of Maine, and each of those are volcanic deposits where there might be some minerals of potential interest for extraction. Bald Mountain is the site right now that most people are focused on. This is an aerial photograph of Bald Mountain, and the concept that is being discussed by Irving Corporation. Irving Corporation is the largest landowner in the state of Maine with 1.25 million acres of land, of forest lands. And within their ownership, they have a number of areas that potentially have mineral rights of interest, and this is one of them. This is a site that has been characterized and looked at by other mining companies previously, and they have abandoned their pursuit of a mine. But Irving seems more interested than what we've seen in the past. In the past, there has been mining, not since 1977 has there been any active mineral mining in the state of Maine. And it was really since 1972 that the last open pit mine was closed. It was the Callahan mine, and that was a mine that was operated from 1968 to 1972. About 5 million tons of non-ore bearing waste rock was extracted. Of that, only 800,000 tons of ore were removed. That's a Superfund site now. It's been closed since 1972. Estimated cleanup cost is about $23 million, 10% of which will be paid by the people of Maine. And 200 truckloads at least of contaminated material have been shipped out of state from that site. That was the last open pit mine. It was a fairly small mining operation, but it has left a continued environmental legacy that the people of Maine are continuing to pay for. This map shows a number of sites. The yellow stars, which are a little bit hard to pick out, are areas where there's been some active mining exploration activity to identify potential ore bodies of sufficient significance that there might be some reason why they might want to do an open pit or a shaft mine. So there's places there called Ledge Ridge, Alder Pond. Katahdin Iron Works is not really in that same category. Mount Chase, and up near the top there is Bald Mountain. The Callahan mine, even though it was closed in 1972, as recently as last September, this is an article from September 21st, Portland Press Herald, a study was released by the Dartmouth consulting firm that identified significantly elevated levels of copper, zinc, cadmium, and lead in the sediment, water, and small fish in the area around that Superfund site. It's down near Blue Hill in the town of Brooksville. Elevated levels of toxic heavy metals in the Goose Pond estuary in Brooksville. And there's a quote here: given the fact that there's so much contamination, it's tough to determine which is the one acting as the major contributor to the food chain effects. So even this many years since that site was abandoned, there's still uncertainty about how much it's going to cost where the contamination is coming from, but there is still a significant residual environmental legacy of this open pit mine, which is the last mine that the state of Maine really had. So let me describe a little bit about sulfide mining, because that's the type of mine, mineral-bearing ore body that we deal with in the state of Maine. The minerals are locked in a sulfide-bearing ore, and once released, that sulfur, when it's exposed to water and air and bacteria, turns into a sulfuric acid-like compound, not too dissimilar from what's in car batteries. And in the United States, 97% of all metals are now mined in open pits. So once you start digging up this sulfur-rich ore and expose it to water, you've got a real serious risk of creating what's called acid mine drainage, which I'll get into in a bit. And that is the source of the water pollution that leaves potentially on the surface or contaminates groundwater. These are some images of some open pit mines. These mines can be as broad as a mile across, hundreds of feet deep, and they leave a fairly significant scar on the landscape. What Irving Corporation is talking about is a 500-acre open pit mine up at Bald Mountain. Mine is really a massive rock generating exercise where there's a huge amount of overburdened waste rock that is generally extracted, and that's the overfill that does not contain any ore of value to the mining operation. And then there's a whole bunch of ore that becomes tailings, and only a small percent, maybe 2% of that turns into ore that goes to the smelter for processing to extract the copper or the zinc or the precious metals. So you may have 198 tons of waste for every 2 tons of ore that has any value. So there's a big waste generation problem. In this case, this is an example of a huge waste rock dump. So as you can imagine, if you're digging a big open pit, you've got a lot of rock that you have to put somewhere. Some of that rock is high in sulfur content and is potentially at risk of generating acid mine drainage. Some of it is not, but you still have to figure out what to do with it. Then after you've processed the ore, you have these large tailing ponds where you dispose of what generally is the sulfur-containing rock waste, and you generally need to put it underwater to keep it from releasing a flow of acid mine drainage. And these tailing ponds have been known to fail. The impoundments sometimes break. There have been some huge catastrophic failures in tailings ponds around the world, which also are a risk. And because the rock that holds the ore for these sulfuric deposits is acid generating, and it can take a very long time for that sulfur to be extracted entirely from the ore, some of these cleanup operations may last forever. And a number of mining operations, within their plan for the development of their mine, they might be there for 10 or 20 or 25 years, but then there might be hundreds of years of cleanup operation that are still required, of active treatment of contaminated water. And if that active treatment stops, then the pollution is released to the environment. It's very difficult to return any of these sites to anything close to what they originally looked like. So that picture of Bald Mountain that I showed you, that aerial photo, if there is ever a 500-acre open pit mine, it will never again look like that image. It will look like a radically diminished and altered former mountain. Maine isn't the only state that's experiencing somewhat elevated interest of mining operations, mining companies. It's happening in Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, a number of these upper tier states, very similar ore deposits, very low grade ore, but there's renewed interest because copper prices are quite high. This is an article that appeared last fall in connection with a mine that is quite controversial, similarly controversial to the Bald Mountain mine, but this is in the Iron Range area in northern Minnesota. And their study predicts, their environmental assessment study predicts that that particular mine may require active pollution treatment for 500 years after the mine has been closed. And that similarly is a copper nickel mine. And this is the sort of thing that has us quite concerned. 500 years of active wastewater treatment. In some cases, that's maybe 498 years longer since the company went bankrupt. In many of these cases that we have seen in our analysis of mining operations, the companies with the collapse of commodity prices may quickly shut down a mine and leave the site with insufficient cleanup funds and transferring that cleanup obligation to the people of that state or whatever the jurisdiction is. So the water quality impacts are really what a lot of the debate has focused on, because Maine is a state with precious rivers, streams, lakes, surface waters, groundwater, and it's not a resource that we really want to mess with, and we don't want to mess with it in a way that is generating a source of pollution for hundreds of years. So the reality of acid mine drainage, it's something that it plagues mining operations around the world. And this is a study that was done in Minnesota. It's called a Mining Truth Report. It's online. It's an excellent, highly referenced analysis of risks associated with mining operations, similar to the ones that we're looking at here in Maine, as well as they're looking at in Minnesota. Companies and state agencies reviewing mine plans almost always predict that there's going to be no pollution. So the permits claim we're going to do it right, we're going to use new technology, and there's not going to be any pollution. So don't worry about it. But they're not able to point to a single mining operation anywhere that has been developed, operated, closed without producing pollution. So there's no clean examples out there and we have asked the proponents of the Bald Mountain Mine, come forward as part of a permitting requirement. Just identify one mine in a similar situation to what you're proposing here in Maine that isn't causing significant water pollution, and they fought strongly to strike that requirement from the statute. And the pollution problems from these sulfide mines, they're not just an issue of old mines using old technologies. There aren't new technologies that suddenly magically make these problems go away. Here in Maine, we've got quite a substantial clean water fishery, cold water fishery resource. This map on the right shows the states where eastern brook trout habitat at various times has been found. Where it's red, the habitat has been completely lost. And where it's still green and blue, and Maine has the biggest stronghold of that in the entire, I think, 13-state area, is where there's still a fairly substantial cold water fishery habitat for brook trout. And it happens that Bald Mountain is right in the middle of that type of habitat. And this is also a resource of significant value for the people of Maine and for visitors. It's part of a heritage of the state of Maine. It's part of the natural beauty and nature-based tourism opportunities for the future. So that resource surrounding the Bald Mountain area needs to be also considered as something that really needs protection. moving forward. Here you can see where the Bald Mountain site is within a Delorme map that shows rivers and streams and lakes in the region. You can see the Fish River chain of lakes, the Fish River, and our concern is that the pollution that might leave a mine operation would contaminate quite a substantial area. And some of this, as I mentioned, is prime brook trout habitat, but there's people who get their drinking water from this river and these lakes, and it's a prime recreation area for people in Aroostook County. So let me describe where we're at now within the process of Maine law and regulations for the purpose of trying to ensure that a mine operation doesn't come into the state that results in substantial environmental damage or substantial transfer of cleanup responsibilities to current and future Maine residents. So the Irving Corporation in 2012 suddenly brought forward a bill to radically alter Maine's law governing open pit mining or shaft mining. They hired two of the most influential lobbying firms in the state, Pierce Atwood, a law firm based in Portland, and Mitchell Tardy. And they spent a very substantial sum in Maine terms, about $120,000, on these lobbyists in the last few weeks of the legislative session. They didn't introduce the bill until the legislative session was almost over, and then they pushed it through knowing that if it had had more time, it probably would have been defeated. We substantially improved that bill, but not to the point where we were comfortable with it, and we were urging everybody to vote against it. It was adopted, unfortunately, in part because of promises by Irving that mining will generate a lot of jobs. So passage of that law then triggered a rulemaking process, and the LePage administration, Department of Environmental Protection, hired a mining industry consultant. Only one firm bid on the proposal to help the DEP develop rules. It happened to be a Michigan-based company that has only worked for some of the biggest mining companies on the planet. They have worked for Rio Tinto, which is probably one of the largest mining firms. And it's a consulting firm that we believe is essentially captive to the mining industry, not a objective in any way sort of consulting firm that would be bringing a balanced perspective, looking out for the environment and for taxpayers. They're not going to propose rules that would offend any future client or push the envelope here in Maine in a way that other states might want to establish higher standards. So the entity that was hired to do most of DEP's rulemaking development, we believe, was biased from the beginning to come up with rules that would be welcomed by the mining industry. So we tried during 2013 to revisit the statute, feeling like the statute had been weakened to the point of directing the DEP to develop weak rules. We needed to go back and strengthen the statute so that we would get stronger rules. We came within one vote of passing that law. It passed in the House 91 to 49 with substantial Republican support, but then we lost in the Senate by one vote. So we were not able to improve the statutory framework within which the rules would be developed. In 2013, we also did release a report. This was a report that was based on Freedom of Information Act requests of the DEP. So we put requests in for all the documentation that DEP had in connection with two mining companies' efforts in the 1990s to also look at Bald Mountain for a possible mine. And what we found in those consultant studies was the studies that were being done for two companies, Boliden and Black Hawk were the names of the companies. The studies themselves we're telling the companies, this site has extremely high arsenic concentrations. The ore has very high sulfur concentrations. The likelihood of significant water pollution problems is almost a certainty. The jobs that might be provided are in the tens or low hundreds, low 100. Nothing like what Irving is proposing. And the DEP didn't bring any of this information forward to the legislature while the legislature was trying to figure out, should we weaken the new law? We were being pushed by Irving Corporation to do it rapidly without lawmakers understanding that previous mining companies have abandoned their efforts to pursue mining at Bald Mountain because of the high risks. So the rulemaking process went forward. This past fall, some rules were brought forward, the ones that North Jackson company developed. We concluded, NRCM and most of the environmental community, the entire environmental community concluded that the rules as they came forward, these are the regulations that any mining operation would have to follow, were too weak to protect our water quality, and they were not sufficiently protective of taxpayers in the future. And the comments that came in overwhelmingly were in opposition to the rules. 248 people submitted comments in opposition to the rules, plus another 2,000 people who signed a petition expressing concern about the rules. There was only 16 people who either testified in support of the rules or submitted comments. And I would say about half of those were people paid for by Irving Corporation. Very small level of support for the rules. This is in front of the Board of Environmental Protection, which is the oversight body of the DEP, but they adopted the rules unanimously, despite all the concerns. And not only did they adopt these unanimously on January 10th, they had hearings at the end of 2013, and then they adopted them at the beginning of this year. They weakened the rules further from our perspective. So here's the article describing how they unanimously approved the rules. That entire board is comprised of people that have been appointed by Governor Paul LePage, and we're concerned that oversight body was not listening to and not paying attention to the public comments that were brought forward expressing concerns about the rules. The chairman of the BEP says, you may not like what we've done our best job, and the legislature can do with these as it pleases. So these rules are now in front of the legislature. That's why there's a very high level of attention and focus at the State House right now about the fate of Maine's mining rules, because they have the ultimate responsibility to approve or reject these rules. So here are some of the reasons. We have a long list of things that are wrong with these rules that we don't think should be put into final rules, but let me just walk through some of them. The rules would allow unlimited groundwater pollution within vaguely defined mining areas. We tried really hard to define what constitutes a mining area. What Irving wants is the ability to pollute groundwater directly underneath as big a footprint as they can. The problem with that is that once you've polluted groundwater, it is very difficult to capture it and process it and manage it. So it can leave a site fairly quickly. The rules would allow mines that could require wastewater treatment forever. We believe that a properly designed mine should be able to finish its cleanup operations within 10 years. The way the rules are drafted, the DEP could actually approve a mine that by design might need hundreds of years of cleanup operation, just like the mine operation, the Polymet mine in northern Minnesota. We don't want a mine that is designed with an expectation that there's still going to be a cleanup operation 500 years from now. It is completely implausible that the money will have been provided to pay for that, or that the people of Maine won't be held accountable for paying those operations. And if it ever stops functioning, you've got the release of pollution into the environment. The rules don't require a mining operator to put sufficient funds up front for cleanup operations. We think that that's necessary, that we believe an independent third-party assessment of cleanup costs should be done. The rules, as they're written right now, would allow open pit mining next to almost any lake in the state with a very little buffer, and many of the state's most spectacular rivers. And as you saw, those big yellow blobs, there's a lot of potential volcanic sulfur ore-bearing sites around the state. And these rules that are being developed, they cover the whole state, not just Bald Mountain. They would allow mines on or next to many public lands, including land for Maine's future properties. So there had been a restriction in the rules that would have ensured that lands that have been purchased by the people of Maine as public lands would be off limits to any future mining operation, and that was weakened. And the rules also would allow injection of drilling chemicals during exploration without any disclosure necessarily of what those chemicals are, and similar to what happens with fracking. So our view is that the taxpayers cannot be on the hook for future cleanup costs. And the examples around the world and across the US where the taxpayers have to put up tens or hundreds of millions of dollars for cleanup operations is the legacy of mining that has to be fresh in the mind of lawmakers and the public. Because if we just think we're going to get a handful of jobs and not think about the long-term cost to the people of Maine, we're in trouble. So here's some examples from Montana. This is one that closed in 1998, not that long ago. The person's quote there, they're going to be treating this in perpetuity. It's not going to be something we're ever going to be able to walk away from. Public funds, $5 million spent, additional $13 million expected. Others in Montana, South Dakota, Colorado range from anywhere from $30 million to more than $200 million of public funding to clean up the mess created by a mining company that extracted the value and then left the state. So this is the big promise that is being dangled in northern Maine that is supposedly why we should be interested in this. Now, Irving claims that there might be as many as 700 direct or indirect jobs. And they point to a study that they refuse to release. I have asked at least 5 times of their lobbyists, of their senior managers, and there has been no willingness to release more than a PowerPoint slide that just makes the assertion. The mining companies that looked at this Bald Mountain site in the 1990s, the Belieden Company and Black Hawk, estimated a high of 130 jobs or as few as 75 jobs. So this 700 number really deserves a lot of scrutiny, but it already has legs. So here was a PowerPoint presentation given by a group called Heuristic Partnership for Progress last week to lawmakers, claiming, in this case, 300 direct jobs, 300 indirect jobs, all these economic benefits, just asserting that the mine would last for 25 years, claiming that it would be billions of dollars of activity, potential for additional mines near Bald Mountain site. Mining has huge economic potential for Maine. None of these claims have been validated in any sort of public way. And there's a huge number of assumptions that go into any analysis like this. How big is the ore body? What are your extraction techniques? How many years are you going to be operating? And none of that has been released. What are your assumptions about in-state employment versus out-of-state? A lot of these mine operations hire many of the top people that come in are from out of state. We don't have a mining culture. We don't have an educated mining workforce. There's no assurance that Maine people from northern Maine are going to get very many of these jobs other than maybe moving some of the rocks, the overfill. We've also looked at studies of mining communities around the country, and this is an interesting study that concluded after looking at a lot of different communities where there's mines. Contrary to longstanding assumptions, roughly half of all published findings indicate negative economic outcomes in mining communities. Certainly if you look at coal mining in West Virginia, a state which is in some ways a sacrifice zone for the rest of the country, with all the coal that's extracted through mountaintop removal and other, it's one of the poorest states in the country. That the value is not being left in those communities. And there's no assurance that there would be a significant economic boost to Aroostook County that would come from this mine operation if it proceeds. Specialized jobs are not accessible to currently unemployed, so any of the really specialized jobs, they wouldn't have the skills in northern Maine to take many of those. Many of these mining operations avoid taxes in a way that robs the state and the local jurisdiction of payments that they presume they might be getting, but then they don't get them. And the pollution can threaten long-term jobs that depend on a clean environment. So fly fishing, other clean water, real estate, other things that depend on a clean environment, you can lose jobs. So there hasn't been any net economic benefit analysis of any form that has been validated throughout this process and debate of the last couple of years. And from our perspective, any mining activity that happens in the state of Maine really would have to meet the highest standards in the industry. And that's what we've been pushing for throughout this. There must be best practices. You must hold any mining operation to the various highest standards. And there's some ore bodies that may be too risky, and we think that the Bald Mountain site is probably one of those, particularly for an open pit mine, that probably should be off limits. And two previous mine operators concluded that the risks were too high and they left. And what we're seeing with Irving is they want to lower the bar so that they can proceed with a very high arsenic concentration ore body, very high sulfur ore body that we believe is inevitably will create some significant water pollution problems. And as I mentioned, it's not just about Bald Mountain. This map, the green is conservation lands, the yellow blobs are the blobs of many of the areas that potentially could have recoverable concentrations of low-grade ore. And this doesn't have all of the lakes and rivers and streams and other natural resource values on it, but there's a lot of these mineral deposits that are near some pretty precious places within the state that affects the wildlife, that affects really large-scale water resources. And that's why we're concerned about the current mining rules coming forward, which we think are too weak, and what we're doing at the legislature is trying to get those rules defeated. The hearing will be held a week from Monday, and then that particular committee, the Environment and Natural Resources Committee, will vote on those rules or amend those rules and send it up to the House and Senate. And from our perspective, those rules are too weak to be put in place for the goals that we think should be front and center, which is protecting our environment and protecting the people of Maine from being stuck with cleanup costs. So those are my remarks, and I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have. Well, interesting, Irving has zero experience in mining. Zero. They have experience in gas stations and timber. So they would enlist another company, a mining company. Canada has many of the world's mining companies. They're based in Canada. So we have no idea who they would partner with. I think this is really a resource. They, like many landowners in the state of Maine, some of the big landowners, have been doing in the last decade, a rigorous assessment of what has value on their ownership and figuring out, are there ways to monetize that value? And so they've identified, well, hey, we got this, it's a fairly sizable ore body. It's got some zinc and copper and maybe some gold and silver in it. And let's see what we can turn it into. We think that their president, Jim Irving, has made some statements which are, from our perspective, naive about the ability to do what he says he wants to do, a 500-acre open pit mine, without causing very significant environmental problems. But we've seen that same message brought forward across the country at other mine sites. There's always a promise of lots of jobs, no pollution, and it turns out to be few jobs and lots of pollution. The Clean Water Act definitely applies, so there are federal regulations. This particular set of rules, the BEP decided that the rules would not require the DEP to even submit them for approval by the feds. So we're developing these rules in isolation of the federal EPA. A lot of the permitting process, so this is just the rules that would be put in place. If Irving wants to pursue a development, they would actually have to come forward with a big development proposal with lots of details. At that point, NRCM and others would do what we could to enlist EPA in that review process. Probably trucks. I don't think they would build a new train line, but I think it's probably trucks to a ship once you've concentrated the ore. They would probably take it down, they'd take it to Eastport or Searsport, or, and then put it on ships and take it overseas to smelt, is my guess. The particular dynamics of how this bill came forward affected people's voting. In 2012, the House and Senate of the legislature were both controlled by Republicans. So it was Republican leadership and a Republican governor, of course. And the bill was brought forward by a Democrat, John Martin, who has been considered one of the most powerful and influential state legislators in Maine legislative history. And he believed and continues to believe that we can do it right and it'll generate some jobs and it's a good thing. A number of Democrats who wouldn't otherwise have voted for this proposal, the bill as it came out of committee, did so, we think, because both John Martin and Troy Jackson lobbied pretty hard many of their Democratic colleagues to break away. The majority of Democrats voted against the bill, but there were a number of Democrats that voted for it. A number of them now regret that, and they switched their vote once the House and Senate switched to Democrat.
The stated John Martin owed Irving $250,000.
And the implication is that John has been relieved of that debt, and he was the sponsor of the bill. And some believe he lost his reelection because people in northern Maine thought that was pretty smarmy. And he is coming back. He's running again this year. He and Troy Jackson seem to go back and forth between each other's House and Senate seats. I'm not sure that any proof was revealed of that connection. Well, we need everybody in the state to contact your legislator and tell them to vote against the mining rules. This is the highest priority of the 28 organizations that are part of the Environmental Priorities Coalition, is to defeat these rules. So by all means, I encourage you to do that. If any of you are interested in coming up to Augusta, a week from Monday, there will be the hearing on these rules. So it's probably at 9 a.m. on the 24th. On the 25th, NRCM has its Citizen Action Day, which is we train people how to talk about our major environmental issues, and then we bring you over to the State House and you can meet with your legislators. And we have these rules that were put in place in 1991, and those will stay in effect until or unless they're replaced by new rules. So it's not like if these rules are defeated, we suddenly don't have anything in place. We have the 91 rules. There are some reasons why the 91 rules do warrant some updating and changing, but the wholesale rewriting that's occurred this time around and what we believe is significant weakening of those rules, is not what we want to put in place of the 91 rules. Rules are designated as either what are called major substantive rules or routine technical rules. It's not always an ironclad differentiation that the major substantive rules are like the really big, important ones. Generally, that's the case. These are big, important ones, and they have to come back to the legislature for final approval. And they would need to be approved by both the House and the Senate and signed by the governor. If they're defeated by one body, just the House, if the Environment and Natural Resources Committee rejects them and it goes up to the House and they affirm that rejection, the Senate, and they just, stay with that position, then they'll die.